his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me." His anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. And the warden of the prison put Joseph in charge of the prisoners who were in the prison, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The warden of the prison did not supervise anything under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made whatever he did prosper. So again, we're seeing where Joseph is in another situation here. Not that he chose to be there, but while he was there, he tried to do the best things, make the right decisions, and the Lord made sure that whatever he did worked out well. All right, and then we're going to skip down to Genesis 40, chapter 1. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1. All right. Then it came about after these things that the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the prison, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. And the captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, behold, they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were with him in confinement in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" And they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do interpretations not belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, saying to him, "In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand as in your former practice when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well for you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." All right. So the baker then told Joseph his dream, and of course, his dream, his interpretation wasn't as well. And of course, not reading out of the Bible in this part here. And of course, Joseph told him that, in 3 days that the Pharaoh will bring him back out of prison, but instead of restoring him to his position, that he would be hanged. And then 3 days later, it was the Pharaoh's birthday, and just as Joseph said when he interpreted the dreams, that God told him what the interpretation was, he said that the baker would be hung. He was. He said that the cupbearer would be restored to position, and he was. So, one of the things that we read about in different places of the Bible where it says that, if you have someone prophesying, if they prophesy something to happen and it does happen, then you know that they were a true prophet and they were prophesying my name, or they were doing what I was telling them to do. Well, in this situation, God gave Joseph the interpretation of the dreams. And when it came to be true, then it also was a revelation to those that knew the interpretation that Joseph was one who was with God, or that God was with him. So it kind of, again, spoke to credibility and, again, God's power. All right, skipping down to chapter 41, verse 1. Chapter 41, verse 1. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And behold, from the Nile 7 cows came up, fine looking and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and thin, and they stood by the other cows of the bank of the Nile. Then the ugly and thin cows ate the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke, but he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain come up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning, his spirit was troubled, so he sent messengers and called for all the soothsayer priests of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this. So the cupbearer reminded Pharaoh of when he had him thrown in prison, and where he met Joseph, and then where he had the dream, and where the baker had the dream. Joseph told both of them what would happen, or what the dreams meant. And of course, just as Joseph said, those interpretations came true. And so Pharaoh, hearing this, said, okay, I wanted to speak to this person or see this person. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. And then before Joseph appeared before Pharaoh, he, of course, got cleaned up, shaved, and got presentable to be in front of the Pharaoh. All right, then we'll skip down to verse 15, 41:15. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning, so I woke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. And then behold, 7 heads withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows, which came up after them, are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following it, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took a signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Okay. All right, then I'll skip down to verse 56. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. So, of course, in this time of 7 good years and 7 bad years, we know that according to this, it affected more than just Egypt, as all the land. And so, we could probably say it's worldwide, or at least all the known land at the time of the writers here. And then this is where it's going to start tying back into Jacob, or Israel, and Joseph's brothers. So, chapter 42. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" So, of course, they're, in the times where food is not plentiful, and obviously they are running out of food and hungry, or at least definitely low on food. So that's kind of why I said, why are you staring at each other? Go get food. Verse 3. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. And then skipping down to verse 6. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold grain to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brother came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. All right, so go back, remember Genesis 37:7. Joseph had the dream that said that his brother's sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. Well, we see that coming true here in chapter 42, verse 6. Okay. So after they bowed down, I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this information now. So Joseph recognized his brothers and knew who they were, but his brothers did not recognize him. And so he asked some questions, kind of find out about his brothers or his family, asked about their father, about, do you have any other brothers? And then kind of how is that? And they said, yes, we have a younger brother. And asked how he's doing. And so then he came up with the idea that he's going to call them, or say that they're spies. And the only way that they can prove to him that they're not spies and that they're honorable men and what they're saying is true is that they were supposed to go home, get their brother Benjamin, and bring him back to show that they were telling the truth. And so he kept Simeon, one of the brothers, with the idea, if you don't bring Benjamin here to prove that y'all aren't spies, then he'll keep Simeon and forever. So they got back home, and they told their father what happened, that they kept Simeon, and that they wanted that Joseph wanted to bring Benjamin back to prove to him that. His father did not want to do that, or didn't like the idea of it. He thought if Benjamin went, that he would have lost Joseph, and then he'd lose Benjamin and as well. And so they stayed there for a while. I don't know how long that they were there, but they stayed until the grain that they had ran low or out, and then they were sent back. And one thing I forgot to put in the paraphrase of what happened. So whenever Joseph told the servants to load their animals as far as with the grain and stuff, he also had the servants put the money for the grain back in their saddlebags. So whenever they got down the road a little bit, one of them looked in their bag and saw that they had the gold seal. So then they were worried that they would definitely be in trouble because they got something without paying for it. And so they were even more concerned about going back and being concerned spies and things. All right, and then skipping down to verse 28. And they said, your servant, our father, is well. Well, let me give you some more information. So they ran out of food, and the father said, okay, go ahead and go back. And they wanted to go back without Benjamin still. Reuben told his father that, the only way we can get Simeon back, and that maybe we'll even get to come back, is if Benjamin goes. And if you let Benjamin go, then I'll be responsible for him. And he kind of made like a life promise that, I'll make sure he comes back or I won't come back type deal. And so the father went ahead and gave in and decided that Benjamin could go. And then whenever they went back, they sent them with all the money they should have paid or would have paid for the original amount of grain that they got. And they had them take double the amount of money for the grain that they wanted to buy. And then also gifts to give to Joseph or Pharaoh or whoever they need to give the gifts to. And then now they're back in front of Joseph, and this is where we're at in verse 28. And they said, your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. Then they bow down again in homage. So again, we can apply this back to verse 37, or chapter 37, verse 7. Their sheaves bowed before Joseph's sheaf again. Joseph had dinner with them, paraphrasing again. Joseph had dinner with them, and he gives them the food. And whenever his servants load their animals again with the food, Joseph tells the servants again to put the money back in the saddlebags that they brought. And as well, Joseph told him to put his drinking cup or a silver cup in Benjamin's bag. After his brothers leave, he sends his servants to go and get them, and he brings them back to him. All right, chapter 45, verse 4 is where we're going to next. Genesis 45:4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold to Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me ahead of you to save lives. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. So God sent me ahead of you to ensure for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. For you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have.'" So, looking back at verse 5, where Joseph's telling his brothers, "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves." They've had several years where they've seen their father sad, upset over the loss of their son. Of course, while they hated him, or where they were mad or hated Joseph at the time, they know that they grieved their father, and they, of course, had plenty of time to see that they did wrong and what they did. And so he's telling them, don't be angry with yourselves. But what I really like about that verse is the part where it says, "For God sent me ahead of you to save lives." Where he's saying that, yes, this thing happened to me, but it was supposed to happen to me because this was part of God's plan. And, to kind of really realize that, things don't just happen sometimes for no reason, that there's always a reason why things happen if we just know what the outcome is supposed to be or what the plan is. All right. Chapter 46, verse 1. So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions in the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also assuredly bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes." And then skipping down to verse 26. All the people belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. And all the people of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. So kind of put that number in your mind of 70 people, or the 70 from Israel and his family, or Jacob and his family, that there were 70 people that went to Egypt. And then later, when we talk about the Israelites leaving Egypt, as far as how many were there then. All right. Verse 33. So this is kind of Joseph talking to his family. All right. "When Pharaoh calls for you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock since our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, so that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians.'" Okay. So, one thing I forgot to mention earlier. So, while Joseph was having his brothers over and they ate at his house, the Egyptians, even though that Joseph was over the land of Egypt, they still wouldn't even eat with him. So you had Joseph sitting in his area, the Egyptians there sit in their area, and then, of course, the Joseph's brothers sitting separately too. So the Egyptians, kind of keep in mind, they didn't feel like the Hebrews were really equals to them, or they kept them separated. And then, of course, they're going to be claiming to be shepherds, which they were. And so the Egyptians thought lowly of shepherds. All right, in chapter 47, just going to kind of hit some thoughts about it. So the family is there in Egypt. Joseph picks out 5 of his brothers to take before Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh can question them, and he also takes his father. Of course, Pharaoh asks them, what are y'all? And they tell him that what Joseph told to tell them in verse 33, that they were shepherds. And then Pharaoh talked to Jacob and asked Jacob how old he was. And this time, or when Jacob is before Pharaoh, he was 130 years old. And then getting into 47, 48. So Joseph was part of the plan they said to do was to keep 1/5 of the grain and the crops and things like that from the good 7 years. And of course, they stored them up. And we know how Joseph's family had to go to Egypt to buy food. Well, Joseph's family wasn't the only ones doing that. There was the Egyptians themselves that were going to buy food from Pharaoh, and there's the people from other lands that were going to buy food from Pharaoh. So during those 7 years of famine, food was so short that the people end up giving all the money they had to buy food to where the point they ran out of money. And then when they went back to buy more food, they had no money, so they sold whatever livestock that they had left or gave that to Pharaoh for food. And then when they went back again over time to get food, they were out of livestock, out of money, and so they had their land. And they didn't have land, they had themselves. So they got to the point where Pharaoh had pretty much all the money in the land, in the area. Pharaoh had all the livestock in the land, and then Pharaoh had the land itself, and he had the people as slaves or indentured servants, where they now worked for Pharaoh. And, if we kind of think about this, when you think about empires or places that have a strong presence in the world, they're usually a place that has a lot of money. So Pharaoh had all this money in the land in his possession or his coffers. And we hear later or think about the military might that the Egyptians had back at that time. Well, how did they get some of that? A lot of this money that they had at this time, or they had the money to pay for that. Okay. All right, so Jacob is, of course, older at this point in time, and he knows that he's in his last days. And so he has Joseph bring his sons to him, and so that he could bless them. And he blesses Ephraim, which is the oldest, and Manasseh, the youngest. But similar to Jacob and Esau, where the youngest got, the blessing or the bigger blessing, Manasseh, being the youngest, got a more preferred blessing as well over Ephraim. And of course, Joseph tried to correct his father or as he was doing this or getting ready to do it, and Jacob told him, no, this is how it is. And basically that Manasseh would be larger than his brother Ephraim, and that he would be over him. And then, of course, we can look at the tribe size or the people and number size of Manasseh, and they were a bigger group of people. You had had 2 territories given to the tribe of Manasseh. So that's kind of another thing that we can see where that blessing came true later in the Bible. Jacob also calls all of the sons together so that he can bless them. And I pulled out a few of the blessings that they said in chapter 49. Start with 1 verse 5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. May my soul not enter into their counsel. May my glory not be united with their assembly. For in their anger they killed men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them among Israel. Of course, we can probably apply some of this to Levi. So the Levites, they did not get their own territories, and they got land, but it was only the land surrounding the cities that they were a part of, but they didn't get an actual territory for their tribe. It's about time. I don't have time to get into why they were considered fierce, but that was due to a situation that happened with their sister. Genesis 49:8, as for you, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares to stir him up, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth white from milk. All right, and then just as a reminder, from the tribe of Judah is the lineage of Jesus. All right, and then kind of closing some things up here because the classes are out. But so kind of the year as far as when things happen. Joseph, he was 17, around 17 or later, or shortly after 17 when he was thrown into the pit. He had a time at Potiphar's house. He had a time in prison. And we know that it was at least 2 years after he gave the after he told the cupbearer what his dreams meant. We know that there was the 7 years of plenty and the 2 years of bad before he met with his brothers. And so we know at that point in time when he met with his brothers, one other age it told is that he was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, whenever he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And so we had the 7 years of plenty and 2 years of bad, so he was 39 years old whenever he was reunited with his family. Okay, all right, we'll stop there.
like to take a few minutes this evening to talk about a few things. I like to talk about how much God loves us, and not only does He love us, that He can also sympathize with us. Jesus came to this world and walked this earth and lived as we do, and He experienced life just like we do. And He's able to sympathize with us because of that. And He has also paid a very high price for us. And so one of the first verse I like to go to real quick here, thinking about God's love for us, you probably have an idea of where I'm going right off the bat. John chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, which reads, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send His Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world should be saved through Him." And so, God tells us that He gave His only begotten Son for us. How many of us would be able to do that? To be able to give up anyone for anyone else? That would be a very difficult thing to do. The next verse I'd like to go to is 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 7. And he says here, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. By this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins." And so I think it's important to notice here that he talks about it's not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be a propitiation for our sins. A verse that has always stood out to me from the time that I was a little boy is Luke chapter 12, verse 7. And so Luke chapter 12, verse 7 reads, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents, and yet not one of them is forgotten before God? Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, you are of more value than many sparrows." And this particular passage has been a great comfort for me from the time that I was a little bitty kid, just knowing that God knows me better than anybody else. He knows me so well. He knows the number of the hairs on my head. Who else would know that, or even care to know that? So He points out to us that He knows us better than anybody else, and that He cares about us more than we can imagine. Isaiah chapter 49, verse 13 reads, "Can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you." And so here, God He's speaking to the children of Israel, and He's comparing His compassion for them to a mother and her newborn child. What mother would have no compassion on her newborn child or her grown child for of any age? And He talks about how even these might forget. It's a pretty rare thing for a mother to have no compassion on her children. But He talks about how even these may forget, but I will not forget you. And I bring this one out because we need to take a second and just think about who gave that mother that compassion, who gave her that drive and instinct to care for her children. You think about our mothers and how a mother will do just about anything to make sure that her kids are taken care of, to make sure that they're happy, to make sure that they've got everything that they need in life. And God's the one that gave her that instinct, that designed her to work that way. And since He's the one that gave her that compassion and designed her that way, He understands that better than anybody else. And that is the level of compassion and love that God has for us. God loves us dearly, and 1 John chapter 4 verse 19 tells us that we love because He first loved us. If it wasn't for God, we wouldn't even have any idea what love is. And so not only does He love us, but He can also sympathize with us. Jesus can sympathize with us. And Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14, reads, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." And if we could also look at Isaiah chapter 53, verse 3, which reads and says that He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one whom men hid their face, or from one whom men hide their face, He was despised, and we did not esteem Him. So not only is Christ able to sympathize with us in regards to temptation, but He's also able to sympathize with us in His experiences in life, because He came here and He lived just like we do. At one point, one of the things that has stood out to me was the fact that there was a time that Jesus, even in His hometown with the people that knew Him His entire life, and His family, took offense to Him at one point, which is talked about in Mark chapter 6, verse 4. And I bring that up because to me, that's just one of the most heartbreaking things that there is, to think that I couldn't go home to my family or my hometown, and to know that my family was going to take offense to me. So Jesus is able to sympathize with us in all of these ways. And, also you have to think about the brutality of His death. He died a death that is the most cruel way to die, the most brutal way to die. And He's able to, I listened to a debate a few months ago between, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was between, in the early 2000s, one of the big atheists at the time and a man who wasn't a member of the church, but he represented the Christian faith, and it was actually a member in the audience had brought a question to this atheist debater and talked about how the fact that Jesus is able to sympathize with those who have been abused and tortured and raped and murdered, because that's what He went through. He died a death that is, beyond cruel. And, He was the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world. And He paid a very high price for us. You think about the events leading up to the crucifixion, how He was abandoned by His friends. He was humiliated. He was beaten and spit upon. He was stripped naked and scourged. He had a crown of thorns pressed into His head. He was forced to carry a cross until He couldn't carry it by Himself any farther. They had to get people to help Him actually carry that cross to His destination. And once He got there, He was finally nailed to that cross, where He hung for 6 hours until He died. And some of the things that we need to, that we should try to take away from that is the fact that one, with a Roman scourging, that was reserved for, slaves and foreigners. It was illegal for a Roman citizen to be scourged. And, oftentimes a scourging alone was brutal enough to kill somebody. Like I had mentioned, usually when someone was scourged, they were, tied to a post or tied to a boulder. They were stripped naked, and then they were beaten. Resources tell us that the tools used in the scourging were bad enough that they could tear into the flesh and expose bone, and oftentimes they could tear a person open to the point that internal organs are exposed. And another thing to think about is think about the very word excruciating. The very word excruciating has a Latin origin, and it means out of the cross or from the cross. The Romans, Christ's crucifixion was so brutal that the Romans made up a word to describe all the shame and torment associated with it. Jesus was also, through all these events, through his crucifixion, he was fully about his senses and aware of his surroundings. He was at one point offered wine mixed with gall, and he refused it once he realized what it was. He didn't take that because numbing his senses would have lessened sin's punishment, and he came to take the full brunt of God's wrath against sin and not to take an easy way out. Jesus loved me and you, his creation, enough to leave heaven, live a sinless life, and die a death that he didn't deserve so that we could be saved and have a way to come back to him. And, he asked that we love him back and that we love one another just the same. John chapter 14, verses 23 and 24 read, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." And so he says that, if we love him, we'll keep his word, we'll keep his commandments. What command has he asked us to keep? He's asked us to obey his gospel, to obey his death, burial, and resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. And so, how do I obey that death, burial, and resurrection? Well, that's by being baptized into Christ, into his death, buried with him, and raised to walk in newness of life. Romans 6, verses 3 and 4. By confessing my belief in him, repenting of a past life of sin, and being baptized for the remission of my sins. Acts chapter 2, verse 38. But it doesn't stop there. You think about, in the real estate world, for example, you have times where a transaction is contingent. Our salvation is contingent. Once we become Christians, our salvation is contingent on being faithful until our lives are over. The offer has been made by the buyer. Jesus is the buyer. The offer has been made and accepted, and that purchase is contingent on passing inspection. And our inspection takes place when our lives are over. If we don't pass that inspection, well, then the transaction's not going to move forward. And so, if there's anyone here tonight that, maybe you find yourself outside of Christ and you realize that you're in need of being obedient to the gospel, being baptized into Christ, we can help you with that. And if there's anyone here tonight that maybe you've already done that and you find yourself wandering away or needing the prayers of the church or having any need at all, you can come forward as we stand and sing, and we'll help you.